Today, World War I is rightfully viewed as an out-of-hand tragedy that resulted from rash decisions and uncalled-for hatred. Thanks to the sheer number of casualties that resulted from the war, it's hard to think of it as anything other than a disaster. After all, out of the 65 million people directly involved in the war, 9 million were killed, 22 million were wounded, and 5 million went missing. An additional 9 million people not directly involved in the war died from starvation and military actions. But is it possible that World War I was essential to Australia's development and sense of identity? At the time of the war, Australia had only existed as a nation for 13 years. This meant that we had no real history or sense of identity. So, as the war united our nation for the first time, it's no real surprise that many people saw this as an opportunity to forge our own identity and make a name for ourselves. While this naive approach was crushed by the realization that war is neither heroic nor glorious, there's no denying that Australians did make a name for themselves using the war. Although initially thought of as undisciplined, they became known as impressive, brave, and selfless soldiers. This view became a part of Australian social identity. With husbands, fathers, and sons away at war, women were expected to take on many traditionally male roles in the workforce. Before the war, women were generally homemakers with roles such as teaching, nursing, dressmaking, and domestic work. Because of the war, women took on roles such as store clerks and bank tellers. By the end of the war, the percentage of women working outside of the home had risen by 13%. Many women contributed towards the war by putting together care packages and sewing warm clothing for soldiers. The war gave many women the opportunity to gain skills and confidence, something that wouldn't have been available if the war hadn't taken place. It's true that the First World War had devastating effects on Australia, especially since it was such a young nation at the time. Out of the 331,781 Australian soldiers sent to war, a total of 215,585 soldiers were captured, wounded, missing, or killed. Over 60,000 of the fittest and most able men in Australia served overseas and never made it home. As a percentage of total troops sent to war, Australia's losses of 18.5% were the highest of any Commonwealth nation. After receiving news of their losses, the reality of war dawned on Australians. There was still strong support for the soldiers, but the excitement had faded. Not only did the war negatively impact Australia population-wise, but the debates and scrutiny that sprang up during the war turned Australia into a divided nation. Because Australia was fighting against the Germans, Australia grew bitter towards all things German. German schools were closed down, German breeds of dogs were abused, and town names that sounded too German were changed. German Australians came under suspicion, with some believing they had divided loyalties, despite many of them enlisting in the Australian Imperial Force. They were considered potential threats to national security, and many were taken into custody. Over the course of the war, 4,500 people considered to be Germans were imprisoned in Australia. And as if this hadn't divided Australia enough, the conscription debate came along. This issue split friends, neighbours, workmates, and even families. Some felt that it was patriotic duty to vote for conscription, to continue the war effort, and those that voted against it were considered lazy, selfish German lovers. There was a growing dissatisfaction of war, along with the sense of inequality of sacrifice that settled over the Australian community. There was bitterness between those who had gone to war and those who had not. Working-class Australians felt that they had contributed most of the war, and that they were being exploited at home. There was a perception that middle and upper-class citizens were less affected by the war, and some even profited from it. While this was not entirely accurate, it only served to increase the growing divisions in the nation. The Gallipoli landing on the 25th of April 1915 particularly contributed to our nation's social identity. Despite the disastrous landing and loss of life, Australians at home met the news from Gallipoli with a sense of pride. Soldiers were praised for their courage and gallantry. In response to the landing, British General Sir Ian Hamilton said, "History contains no finer record of dauntless bravery than is here described." King George V praised the soldiers, stating that they had indeed proved themselves worthy sons of the Empire. In local newspapers, Anzac troops were hailed as the Knights of Gallipoli. Because this was the first time Australians had fought in war, the Gallipoli campaign and Anzac legend are even more significant. When news of the battles at Gallipoli was received, the fact that landing had been a failure was almost completely overlooked. Gallipoli is often considered a defining national experience, and it has been said that Australia became a nation on the shores of Gallipoli. Today, 95 years after the war memorials can be found in virtually every Australian town and city. One such memorial in Canberra is one of the most visited sites in the country. Every year, ceremonies are held to commemorate the wars in which Australia fought. These events are held on Anzac Day in April and Remembrance Day in November. In many countries, people pause for 1 minute at 11 a.m. on Remembrance Day to remember those who gave their lives in war. The legacy of the war and our soldiers have become an essential aspect of Australian identity, shaping our society and culture. Legend has developed around Gallipoli that only grows stronger. School children learn about the Gallipoli landing and relish legends such as the story of Simpson and his donkey. While it's true that the war was a disaster for everyone involved, it was essential to the nation's development, giving us a long-lasting legacy and establishing the role of women early in our history.
Feeling my way through the darkness, guided by a beating heart. I can't tell where the journey